What's going on, y'all? KMBest here to walk you through the best decks in Marvel Snap. Now, do keep in mind, it's only a few days post-OTA, so these are just going to be my impressions of what the top-level metagame is, and of course, it could be different for you, and it could change any moment, so we're going to be a little bit more wide-ranging than normal, and try to cover basically everything that you can reasonably expect to see. First up, this is my current build of Loki. Loki remains, in my opinion, the best deck to play, and this build of it is my favorite right now. I finally got around to realizing Werewolf by Night just simply isn't good in the list anymore and removed him. Now I'm playing Bishop in that spot, and I'm back to Rogue and Shang-Chi. However, the actual big questions I have in this list are, can we afford playing, say, Enchantress and Shadow King instead? Because Enchantress is answering a lot of problems right now that Rogue is not. For example, Living Tribunal decks are back in a big way. They are showing up everywhere. I did a video on them yesterday, and that means that you need things like Enchantress that really answer those and not just Rogue. By the same token, there's a lot of even the ongoing decks are playing Zabu and Ravonna, and they can protect their big payoffs with Zabu and Ravonna and force your Rogue to be a 50-50. As someone who's lost several Rogue 50-50s for a reasonable amount of cubes, I do wonder if Enchantress might be a better inclusion, but I balk at including both Enchantress and Shang because that seems so pricey. So I don't exactly know what the perfect tech package is in here. I think Rogue Shang covers enough of it, and this playstyle should be very familiar to people who are used to playing Loki. You just have, like, your scaling threat is a lot worse now. Bishop is no werewolf, but he is pretty good. Like, I will say, Bishop is actually pretty good. Collector Loki is obviously still broken. And I think the major thing that I like about this is that it is very good into Loki mirrors, because your opponent out of this deck gets maybe one relevant card ever, and that would be, you know, Shang-Chi. And sometimes, of course, if they're playing Loki, you know, they're another Loki, a collector, things like that are good. But outside of those that every Loki deck plays, there's like one other relevant card in here, and that's Shang. Whereas if you're playing things like Miss Marvel, Alioth, Devil Dinosaur, those going into my hand when we both play Loki mean that my Lokis are better than yours. And so this is sort of where my head is at as far as why I like this build of Loki specifically. A deck I think is truly underrated and might be one of the best in the game right now is Leech Hawk. I think it is incredibly well positioned, but the real question is figuring out what the best use of your tech slots are. Leech is extremely strong right now. There's Hela's running around, Mr. Negative's running around. There's a bunch of early meta combo stuff happening. Leech shuts that all down. Living Tribunal, no, not here, not happening. Leech, it's gone. Now, you still have to worry about top decks, and I think one of the things playing Leech does make you vulnerable to is the retreat later button, because you won't know if your opponent top decked it, and that means that you'll have to play as if it was possible that they did in some situations, or just accept that you're going to lose and just be like, all right, sometimes if they top deck it, they have it, that's fine, I'll deal with a 1 in 4. I think I'm 75% to win that, because that's the odds that you win if they only have one out of 4 cards in their deck. So the way that this deck looks to play is to rely on Leech to cover as much of the ground that it can here. But the real question for me is, what are the other complementary cards that go around it? And by that, I mean your 3s and your 4s especially can really vary depending on what you're trying to target. The list you're looking at right now is more of a generalist. It's just looking to have reasonable matchups into everything. And so it runs Shang-Chi in addition to Leech. And that is, I think, fine. This list, on the other hand, has more specific tech. It's got a Rogue in there for Miss Marvel decks. Very, very important to hit that when you can. And it's not running Shang-Chi at all, rather running Shadow King as a specific anti-Loki type countermeasure. And that, I think, is another pretty reasonable way to approach this. This is like, I'm targeting specific matchups with this, and because I'm targeting specific matchups, we are then able to move forward and build the deck to do that. Now, another deck this deck is targeting very heavily is Thanos Blob. Having Killmonger in your deck is great against Thanos generally, and of course, having Leech in your deck turns off that blob. Now, again, the question is your 3s, your 4s, sometimes even your 2s. The last few slots in this deck are definitely something that you need to customize. And while I do think the core baseline plan here, you know, Zabu, Korg, Rock Slide, Doctor Doom, Iron Lad, Darkhawk, that all stays in the deck. Leech stays in the deck. You can really mess around with basically everything else and try to figure out how to beat the metagame you see, which gives you, I would say, anywhere between 3 and 5 real flex slots here, but you can really customize this to beat what you want. If you are not worried about Thanos and you want to beat Loki more, well, run Mobius over Killmonger. If you are worried about Tribunal, you can actually put an Enchantress in here too. Like, there is just a ton that this deck can do, but one thing I would encourage you to keep in mind is how dangerous it can be to give Loki decks tech that work against your cards. And it's almost impossible to avoid at some point, and for that reason, I think, you know, running Mobius is a fine concession, running Shadow King is a fine concession, but it will be one of those situations where sometimes you just are going to have to run that risk. You're going to give them your Shang-Chi because you have to run the Shang-Chi. You're going to give them your Rogue because you have to run the Rogue. And so do keep in mind that in those matchups, you need to try to protect your big guys from your own tech, in this case, Rogue or Shang-Chi. This is the deck I like to call Do They Have It Simulator, and I think its influence is pretty relevant right now in terms of what you have to be prepared for and how that impacts the tech cards you bring in other decks. For those who are unaware, I just did a highlight on this deck one day ago. You can go watch that for more on this deck specifically. Shout out to HelaEnjoyer, whose list made it all the way to the top 10. That is the deck highlight that we did yesterday. However, if you want to understand it in brief, this is a true all-in combo deck. There are 3 types of cards in it. There are cards that get you to your combo. Those are Jubilee and Iron Lad. They are effective card draw pieces. There are cards that cheat energy, you know, Zabu, Ravonna Renslayer, Sarah. And then there are cards that allow you to activate your combo. And this is, you know, Mystique, Onslaught, Miss Marvel, and you have a bunch of different combos in the deck. The main ones you're looking at are, of course, you know, Tribunal, Onslaught, Iron Man type stuff, but also you are very able to win if you say Onslaught, Mystique, Miss Marvel. That adds 30 power to the 2 side lanes. It's a very, very strong thing to do. Now, the one real weakness this deck has is, you know, do they have it? In this case, it mostly refers to Enchantress. Enchantress is a card that you find it very, very, very difficult to beat. It is extremely tough for you to beat that card, and it will be some extremely negative cube scenarios for you if it comes up a lot. So please do keep that in mind, that this deck is for those of you who are willing to say, I will lose this if they have it. And you have to be able to make that call, because if you start leaving every game because they might have Enchantress, you're going nowhere. And that means that this is a deck that is risky. It is high risk, high reward. But right now, it is a very powerful option, and it should be not only in your arsenal, but very much in your awareness. You should know what this deck is trying to do, and you should be very afraid when it's doing it and you don't have an answer. This deck hard farms anything that is just doing points and is not actually trying to interact in any way. If you are just putting points on the board and you don't have, like, you know, the Leech out of Darkhawk, a Rogue, an Enchantress, you are going to get run over when this deck does what it does, and it does what it does with remarkable consistency. Please, please, please don't be too bold into this kind of stuff. I'll be honest with you, I'm not quite sure how good Thanos is right now. I do not have an overwhelmingly high opinion of it without Professor X being cheated out. And you'll see here that there is no Professor X in this build. And if you want to go back to Professor X, you can very easily cut Doctor Doom for him. The Doctor Doom is something I saw Batman doing, a high elo Asian server player. And I was like, oh yeah, when we have Killmonger in this deck, we actually can play Doctor Doom. And that's kind of nice. One of the other things I was thinking about is, can we ever get back to Odin in this deck? Like, can we do, like, wave into Odin again? But that's not nearly as good as it used to be when the wave was affecting both sides, unfortunately. It is interesting just how much this deck looks like the old version of Thanos Lockjaw, Killmonger Death, all that stuff. It's very, very compelling to me in theory, but in practice, I feel like I beat this deck a lot right now. It is not going over the top of things like the the Tribunal deck. It's just gonna get run over by that most of the time because there's just not really interaction for it. And that means that you have to like start doing things like taking Shang-Chi out for Enchantress, which makes you worse in other matchups where Shang-Chi is more generally applicable. And it's just sort of a very difficult line to walk, fitting the right 12 cards into your Thanos deck. That said, this deck is at heart actually a ramp deck. You are here to do things that are not fair. You have Wave that lets you do that. You have Lockjaw that lets you do that. You are trying to get ahead. You also have, of course, Time Stone in there. Get ahead and do your unfair things. And Blob is still just as good as he used to be. He's still very, very large, but it's a little harder to set up those situations where you are comfortable playing only one card on turn 6 because of the loss of Professor X. You are going to be less comfortable playing this deck. It's going to feel less easy, and I do think it got a decent amount worse. One of the major through lines of this metagame, now that it's sort of become a little bit clearer, is that there's a lot of people that are willing to just play decks that go over the top of stuff. And Hela is definitely a deck that is going to go over the top of a lot of things. But the interesting thing about Hela is it is no longer the biggest boy in the room. Hela now is smaller than the Living Tribunal combo decks, which go much over the top of this deck. And that's a really interesting situation because Hela's whole, like the whole logic of Hela's viability is predicated on it being the biggest thing in the world. And right now, the only thing that's keeping that matchup from being absolutely the worst thing you've ever seen in your life is Silver Samurai hitting Iron Man. That is the only thing that is keeping it from being like the scariest, absolutely, you cannot win this in a million years, is Silver Samurai blowing up their combo somehow. So Silver Samurai, unfortunately, right now, is pretty key to this list. It makes a lot of sense why it would be in here, despite the fact that I have lost way too many games to Silver Samurai popping out of a Lockjaw and discarding my Hela. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know who made this deck. I got it off of Untapped, and I was absolutely shockingly impressed with it. One of the weird things about this is you're gonna look at it and be like, oh, it's a Ronan deck. And I want to be like 100% clear. Absolutely not. This is just a Lockdown deck, and Ronan is your Gamora. That's it. That's the only thing that's happening here. You are just exactly the same Lockdown deck as previously. You are a Storm, Miss Marvel, Doctor Doom, Nebula deck. You're doing the same thing you were already doing, except you are now playing Big Ronan, and you have, instead of the Doom on 6 play, you can often do something like Mystica Ronan, play a Maximus, and that is pretty good, right? Like, that is the major thing that is different comparing this version of the Lockdown deck to previous versions of the Lockdown deck. You also lost Professor X, and I know this is going to sound weird, but I do not think Professor X was actually very good in Lockdown. He was very good in Thanos, but he was not very good in Lockdown. Lockdown has basically, since she came out, been a Miss Marvel deck. It remains a Miss Marvel deck. Please don't let the Ronan distract you from that. He's just your Gamora. He is there to be big. Sometimes you need a big guy, and he is an extremely big guy. That's really all he's doing. Don't get overexcited. Don't get overinvested. Understand, a lot of the time, your best play is still going to be mystiquing a Miss Marvel and then playing Dr. Doom, because that's pretty freaking broken. Please, please, please don't get sucked in by the Ronan. That said, yeah, it's actually like a shockingly competent deck. Like, I do not ever expect these decks to be good. And I play them and I'm like, oh, okay, you know what? Yeah, this actually does make sense. You just can't be an all-in Ronan deck. If you're an all-in Ronan deck, you get absolutely run over by Loki. This deck at least has the ability to use a Storm kind of game plan. It still kind of gets run over by Loki, but like, that's neither here nor there. If you don't see a lot of Loki, this deck gets a lot more viable because it is just playing that old Lockdown style of play. And I think that it is worth highlighting as such, because I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, what's the Lockdown list look like? And I think this is a legitimately good one. Now that we've moved on towards the back end of this tier list, I think it's time for us all to acknowledge that Destroy, while still functional, has sort of been slowly falling off for a little bit now. And that honestly makes me kind of sad, because like, this is an archetype that I like both conceptually and mechanically. I think it's good that this archetype exists and does good things. But right now, it just isn't in a very good spot. There's a lot more people running Mobius now, for example. There's a lot more people running things that are going to be able to deal with your null now, for example. And so it just ends up in this situation where the metagame is very similar to before the patch, except more people are running things that beat you. And that means that Destroy is not in a very good spot. I'm not saying it's like, oh, you can't play Destroy, just it's probably a middling deck rather than a top tier choice right now. It has obviously a million problems with like every Tribunal deck. You just cannot win that matchup ever. And if you start diluting your deck to play tech, then you just don't actually do the thing that you do, which is barely good enough to keep up with other decks as is. It's a fine deck. Don't let me tell you not to play it. But if you have better options, I would strongly investigate those if I were you. She-Naut is in a weird spot where it is a combo deck that can still run Leech. And actually, the weird thing about She-Naut is that it has just so many ways to screw people over. In this list, I've opted for an Echo over Nebula, which I think is kind of like a guess of a choice, right? It's just like, I like the idea of screwing people over, but if you don't want to run Echo, yeah, you can play Nebula. You have plenty of other ways to screw people over. You already run Armor, Cosmo, Leech. I'm not sure exactly how much more Echo does for you, but that said, she is like the remaining piece of tech that can actually work through a Cosmo. Echo is pretty okay right now in the metagame. I do think it's possible she's a little bit overkill if you're already a Leech deck, but hey, you just put her in the mid lane, she shuts down a Miss Marvel, that's fine, right? Like, that's a 1/7, right? That's basically Ebony Maw. Maybe you could even call it a 1/12, but, I mean, you can't because no one will play their Miss Marvel there, but at least forcing them to play it off of there gives her an additional 5 points, so she's a 1/7. It's basically Ebony Maw against Miss Marvel decks. Other than that, though, the deck remains the same. You are right now a lot more reliant on Leech than you previously were. Leech is very, very good into a lot of what people are playing right now. A lot of late game power spikes in both combo decks and in actual decks. And that means that Leech is going to be a pretty key card in a lot of matchups. The issue I have with this list is I think it's probably a worse Leech deck than the Leech Hawk deck. And, you know, maybe you just have to live with that. But if you like playing She-Naut, you still can. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching all the way through this video. I hope you found a deck to play and hopefully climb with in Infinite. For me, I've been playing a lot of the Loki list. I do think it's probably still the best list in the game, but it is an interesting time for the Marvel Snap metagame because of just how different this one is than everything else, because of the influence of these over-the-top combo decks like Living Tribunal and Hela. These are decks that have basically never been on my tier list before. With the exception of Hela some of the time, these are not decks that are very, very commonly found here. And I think the fact that they are is heralding an interesting time for this metagame. And I don't know how long they'll stay that way. Obviously, the more Enchantresses they are, the more unplayable Tribunal gets. But right now, there's not enough to make it unplayable. And I'm still running Rogue in my Loki deck, so why wouldn't you at least try to get my ass with it? Thank you so much for watching. I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.